Focusing on the visit of Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry to Sudan, discussing the Libyan file with the neighboring Libyan countries, neighbors to Libya. And joining us here in the studio to shed more light on this file is Dr. محمد Abdalhalim, the political analyst. Dr. Abdalhalim, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we start our discussion with Dr. Abdalhalim, let's check out this report regarding Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry's visit to Khartoum, discussing the Libyan file, and we'll be right back.
The meeting of foreign ministers of Libya, neighboring countries, which was concluded in Khartoum on Thursday, affirmed that the permanent solution to the Libyan crisis depends on the choice of the Libyans themselves. The final communique of the meeting underscored the importance of a united initiative, which is sponsored by the United Nations, that reflects the desires and priorities of the Libyan people. The ministers renewed their commitment to support Libya in the framework of peaceful political transition based on a consensual application of the political agreement aimed at achieving national reconciliation and establishing unified and strong national institutions that are credible to all Libyans. Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry attended the meeting, which was chaired by the Sudanese Foreign Minister محمد and attended by special representatives for Libya of the United Nations Secretary General Hassan Salama, along with the foreign ministers of Libya, Chad, Algeria and Tunisia, in addition to senior delegates from the Arab League and the African Union and French and Italian envoys. The conference fully supported the UN Special Representative's plan on Libya, including the recent briefing to the UN Security Council. It stressed the preservation of the unity and sovereignty of Libya and its territorial integrity, and respect the political agreement signed on December 17, 2015. The meeting also affirmed the rejection of foreign intervention in Libya's internal affairs, as well as boosting of the principle of consensus without exclusion. The communique praised the improvement in the security situation in the capital Tripoli and welcomed the economic measures that have begun to bear fruit, and stressed the need to continue the economic and security reforms.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Starting off our discussion right away, Dr. Abdalhalim, now this has been the latest meeting regarding the Libyan file. What has been discussed during that meeting? What have been the topics on the agenda of this meeting that have been different, or maybe sort of a progression or a development on the previous meetings regarding
right, that sort of high-profile visit on the part of Foreign Minister Mr. Sameh Shoukry comes to be regarded as very much important at this particular stage, particularly when it constitutes supposedly the seventh visit, I would say. It's a continuation in somehow or another to Palermo, actually the sort of the international minimal or mini summit that was to be held actually during the course of the last months by His Own Excellency Mr. Fattah Sisi himself in Italy, and it would insist every now and again on al-Sakhirat agreement. I myself, I see no reason why any other sort of parties actually should intervene or interfere within the indigenous affairs and the internal part of Libya, discussing, the sort of the supremacy and the sovereignty actually of other international powers. Nothing outside the indigenous citizens should be decided and taken. Sorry. In addition to the fact that the self-same insistence every now and again on the UN security, canons and laws, the UN interests, which is the Sakhirat agreement that was to be held actually in 2015 under the auspices of UN, United Nations OTI, sending Martin Copeland, that was back in 1915, and the self-same, disciplines and laws and insistence every now and again on the liberation and the sovereignty of the Libyan people. The problematic situation in Libya actually seems to be quite different from Syria, from Palestinian territories, from Yemen, actually, from all other parts of the world, it seems to be quite aspiring pride of place among our own political and strategic interests insofar as it's a strategic importance to our own border lines, very much adjacent to our own lines, and much the same way that, you know, I mean, we are mutually identified with each other. The fact that Libya, since quite a long period of time, has been tied, actually, and being part and parcel of the sovereignty of Egypt to a greater extent, being very much supervised even during the previous years of late Colonel Muammar al-Qaddafi. It had been there, actually, and sorry about that. And the assistance, actually, on the political authorities' interest, actually, stems from the fact that it constitutes a pride place, our own prime interests, political, strategic, military, as much as economic. During Palermo summit that was held by Mr. Al-Sisi, His Own Excellency, last month, we have had a large number of results that we would have to agree on and upon, which is, first, the stemming and the insistence on the security agreement, nothing outside the stipulations of the sort of agreement that would bring all the factions and all the opposing parties together, actually, under the auspices of the United Nations, representing, you know, two tussling or confronting parties, that is Faiz Sarraj and Khalifa Al-Qasim Haftar. The fact that Mr. Al-Sisi would insist every now and again on bringing them together.
Yes. Well, Dr. Abdulhalim, this meeting brings together the Egyptian Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry along with the Sudanese Foreign Minister, also foreign ministers from Chad, Tunisia, Algeria, and obviously the UN envoy to Libya. Now, before we start talking about what exactly can Egypt do for the Libyan file, what can countries such as Chad and Tunisia and Algeria also do to help solve this Libyan issue?
Part of the dilemma, actually, that was during the course of Palermo summit that had been discussed to a greater extent was the subject of the illegal immigration. Libya, as it stands with its own wide territorial lands, exposing a great deal of its borderlines to the Mediterranean Sea, is subject to, you know, a large number of immigrants, actually, that come from here, there, and everywhere, exporting all this, so to speak, you know, all these immigrants, actually, to other European countries. That's why a large number of African countries as well are very much concerned with the sort of the stabilizing orders and the canons of Libya, and regaining again the sort of the regime under the leadership of one elected president that should be, you know, I mean, selected on the part of the Libyan citizens. And this is one fact. Another main important fact stems from the fact that a large number of African immigrants actually would try to escape every now and again to the borderlines of Libya, constituting militias and struggling opposing factions, as much as ISIS groups actually would come, sorry about that, from Libya. That's why you may find that all these countries are very much concerned about the stability and regaining regime, actually, to Libyan land again, in much the same way that we, as political authority here in Egypt, as a political stance, actually, are very much concerned with the heart of the strategic importance of that stability and of regaining and of reaching to a consensus of opinion among the Libyan people, actually, on selecting a sort of leader that would come by democratic elections, that would represent one unifying armed forces. So instead, sorry about that, and instead of, you know, the sort of the disagreement that was there during the course of the 2017 between Colonel Haftar, when he would insist every now and again on dissolving the Libyan parliament, and of the invalidity, actually, of Khalifa Al-Qasim Haftar's supremacy as being the head of the you know, of the ministers, as being the prime minister, I would have said. And in the meantime, I think that the sort of the issue that was prevalent during the sort of the summit that was to be held in the by Mr. Sameh Shoukry was regaining and reforming again the infrastructure of the Libyan land, in such a way as to be very much peaceful as it was to be used before, and much the same way that reaching to a consensus of opinion and agreement among the people on reaching to either the sort of the finalization of the 18-month period of coming together or extended and prolonged to a couple or about 6 months as a final decision, or to reach to the democratic election of a parliament on the one hand, as much as on a leader at the end of the day.
Yes. Well, would you say that these summits would actually work on trying to mediate or uniting these factions, whether if it's Khalifa Haftar's or Faiz al-Sarraj, or is it really about controlling the borders and really trying to have some sort of a control over the immigration issue so as to, in a way, contain the situation on the ground in Libya? Is it a case of diplomacy and mediation between the Libyan factions, or controlling the borders of the Libyan state?
Well, boss, I can really discuss it on both regional as much as international levels. On regional level, let me say that, the problematic situation of the illegal immigrants and the immigration in general is such a headache and nightmarish aspect that would threaten all the European countries. They are paying heavy taxes as much as huge amounts of money, actually, in safeguarding as much as in abiding all these immigrants. In addition to the fact that they would constitute what you might call a hotbed for the terrorist acts and actions, actually, of which most of, not almost all the European countries would go through. And much the same way that on an international level, I think that America seems to be quite endorsing a sort of a hidden agenda, trying to, scrutinize the whole political situation on a distance. Even during the sort of the attack by the NATO on Libya, it did not interfere in any conceivable respect. It just monitor, stabilize, direct, as much as channel the sort of the devastation of the infrastructure of the Libyan land, in favor of actually taking seizure of the oil, which seems to be quite the final strategic importance for almost all the European countries, even including Italy, actually, the sort of the meeting ground for the previous summit that was to be held during the course of the last month in Palermo. The fact that we wouldn't have to forget that Italy as well would have its own strategic and either pre-colonial or post-colonial, actually, periods. Its own insistence of being in there is just one way or another of getting into the Mediterranean area, in much the same way that it is one way or another to get into the heart of Africa. That seems to be quite of prime concern, actually, not almost only for America, but also for Russia as well, and for a large number of European countries. That's why, on an international level, actually, Libya seems to be quite of a prime concern and of a strategic importance on an international level for almost all the NATO countries, including the United States of America as well, no matter how, the ends would seem to be quite different in each single individual case between the Western world on the one hand and the American side, thirdly, by the Russian interference that would have its own way, actually, of getting, as I've just said, into the heart of Africa through Libya, actually.
So you would say that the American administration's interest in Libya would actually be similar to the European interest in Libya, manifested mainly in countries such as Italy as well, mainly economic, mainly the oil output coming out of Libya?
Well, I mean, given the fact that Donald Trump, being one of those iconic figures, actually, within the world of business, he would have to have his own way, actually, of the Middle East and on the Mediterranean area, actually, through the sort of the economic interests and economic ends, I would say. The fact that he would go with a certain plan and a hidden agenda in his own mind, actually, to try to drain all the wealth as much as the sort of the fortunes of the East. We have had a very bad experience, actually, of his own attempt, actually, to get into Saudi Arabia, to try to drain the sort of the fortunes and the wealth, actually, of Saudi Kingdom. And much the same way that he would keep an eye, actually, only on Libya for economic reasons as much as on strategic. But the case is slightly different for the European countries. They would have, actually, to have their own way, actually, of getting into the heart of Libya just by way of attempting every now and again to try to interfere into the previous plan of charting and recharting and remapping the sort of the gas area within the Mediterranean. About a couple of months ago, Mr. President Fattah Sisi did, inaugurate a sort of a very international summit, strategic one indeed, with Alexis Tsipras as much as the Prime Minister of Greece and Alexis. Those two main figures that are very much controlling the sort of the gas within the Mediterranean and very much responsible for exporting it actually to the European countries. And as such, the only way actually to get into these very much strategic and hot areas actually, and very much important from a diplomatic point of view as well, is getting through Libya actually. So, and here lies the strategic importance of Libya. In addition to our own main interest actually of being able to safeguard and defend our own borderlines, particularly from the West. The lack of the supreme authority and the lack of the sovereignty under one unified armed forces, so to speak, one unified elected charismatic leader by the Libyan people would maximize and double the sort of the price that is to be paid on the part of our own armed forces. Instead of negotiating with one definite, particular, individual leader, no matter he may be, actually, you may find yourself quite responsible as a sort of an army to defend your own borderlines in much the same way to defend the borderlines of Libya as well. It's about 1,200 kilometers that are exposed actually to, you know, struggles, attacks, and mutual penetrations, and the sort of the stupendous intervention on the part of the ISIS groups. And as such, it seems to be quite doubly priced. It seems to be quite, at the end of the day, a sort of a tribute that you'd have to pay and maximize the sort of the price that's ultimately paid at the end of the day. And I think this is part of the strategy of Mr. Al-Sisi actually of defending our own borderlines. That's why there was the insistence, no matter how expensive it may be, to erect the sort of Mohammed Najib military base actually that would defend and safeguard our own borderlines. And the sort of the successful operations actually of Sinai, middle and northern part of Sinai 2018, the comprehensive operation was a continuation actually of the same situation. And as such, it seems to be quite very much important for our own interests on regional level, as much as for international reasons actually, to try to be very much careful about our own major borders, in much the same way that we would have to be quite aware of the internal situations as much as it was to be actually with external affairs, particularly looking on the strategic heart of our own major you know, I mean, attendance in there as stemming out from Libya.
Well, it seems that all the neighboring countries surrounding Libya, including Egypt, they want the safety, they want the security, they want the sovereignty of Libya as well. Now, talking about the US interests and the European interests, would it be in their favor to actually have the reconstruction of the infrastructure in Libya so as to be able to find some sort of a proper mechanisms of exporting or getting a share of the oil and gas from Libya? Or is it even better for them if this situation in Libya stays as is, and it would be maybe even cheaper for them to get the oil and gas?
Well, towards seeming they would attempt every now and again to reconciliate those two opposing parties and reconciliate the factions and those militias and those tussling groups and sectarian parts actually of Libya. This is to outward seeming. But deep down they have got their own hidden agenda, which is turning the whole area into a hot tin roof of an area of a severe turmoil. And the inevitable question which inevitably arises in here is what is, you know, the hidden secret behind that. First, it's a sort of manufacturing as much as, you know, reproducing a large number of weapons and highly technological weaponry actually to be used only for the devastation and demolition of the infrastructure of the Libyan land. This is to begin with. Well, for another reason, the fact remains that they would have to have actually, you know, their own, what you might call the new map of the road of reshaping the Middle East in such a way as to be not the big Middle East that used to be, but actually a new Middle East based on turmoil, divisions, sectarian groups, devastating opposing facts, in the interests of themselves that would return to them. Because, I mean, if you may remember about 15 years ago when the first devastation of the Anglo-American attack on the Iraqi territories, they would, at the end of the day, reconciliate all the opposing parties in their own interests by reconstructing Iraq again. And the sort of the final tribute that is to be paid was on the part of the Iraqi people themselves. And the American companies actually would take those merchandise things and items actually just by way of getting millions and millions in favor of reconstructing Iraq again. I think that the same scenario will be repeating every now and again, particularly, you know, at Libya. Nowadays, it seems to be quite at a great deal of turmoil, and they would insist at the end of the devastation of almost the 5 or 6 millions actually that they are there, that they will have to inhabit the new land based on peace, reconciliations, reconstructing Libyan territorial lands in favor of their own American companies actually. So the agenda is straightforward and very much direct, being channeled and directed towards draining the wealth of the East, as it was to be actually inaugurated during the course of the last year by the, you know, the devilish sort of visit on the part of Donald Trump to Saudi Arabia, and leaving the whole kingdom actually at a great deal of disputes and struggles among the individual royal family figures actually until today. You know, we have had a large number of series of heartbreaking adventures, last of which was Gamal Khashoggi's devastation and assassination actually in Turkey, actually in the interests of turning the whole Saudi kingdom actually into a land of turmoil. And I think the same scenario was to be adapted actually in Libya in their own favor of getting their own fortunes and wells of oil, as much as reconstructing the land that would go to their own, you know, I mean, into some buckets at the end of the day. That's why, all in all, actually, they have nothing to do with peaceful reconstruction of the Middle East, changing and remapping the sort of the land into such a democratic sort of land that will be re-evaluated in the light of their own people. All what we would do, actually, I think that in the due course of time, we would have on the part of the presidential authority to intervene just by way of reconstructing the armed forces of Libya under one unified supreme leader, actually, that would be elected on the part of the military figures of Libya. And second, the economic intervention, actually, which is channeling and directing the fortunes of Libya to their own favor, to the individual figures of Libya that are blaming of impoverishment and a great deal of poverty, despite the fact that the sort of the oil that is to be reproduced on a weekly basis actually is a huge percentage actually. And thirdly, to try to work on a diplomatic and strategic level by breaching a consensus of opinion among the Libyan people actually to agree of putting down all their own, you know, I mean, disagreements and all their own sense of hatred and opposition parties into the process of being under one leadership of one leader to be elected, no matter he may be, and much the same way to prepare for the coming of democratic parliamentary figures that would rule side by side with the Supreme Libyan Council that was erected during the course of the Skhirat Agreement in 2015.
Yes. Well, we're going to get to the diplomacy and trying to bridge any sort of divisions between the Libyan factions. But before that, you've mentioned, Dr. Abdulhalim, that it is a very expensive operation to actually secure the borders with Libya. And there is this Sudanese initiative. The Sudanese Foreign Minister, the Deri, actually called for the deployment of regional forces along the border with Libya in order to sort of have some sort of security and stability within these borders. Do you feel that having regional forces would actually be a step forward to maintaining some sort of control over the borders with Libya?
So regional and the sense of being Libyan citizens, of Libyan nationality, I would say. Because, I mean, you know, Chad, Niger, and all these African countries actually would have their own way of intervening within Libya. So, I mean, by national figures, I would really insist on chauvinistic figures that are insisting of now and again of carrying Libyan ideas, I would say, of being very much scanned to a greater extent of their own extreme sense of loyalty towards the unification of the Libyan land and one sense of loyalty towards just one individual leader, actually. So the sort of the regional decision-taking or decision-making, actually, by deploying regional figures should stem out from the tribes themselves into the inside of Libya. But before getting into what you might call the regional interference and deployment of figures in Libya, I think that we would have to have a sense of consensus of opinion or agreement among the tribes themselves, because they are very much, against each other, opposing each other in almost every conceivable respect. They are very much represented by their own fanatic interventions within the process of ruling Libya. They are insisting every now and again on bloodshed and devastation every now and again, each of which would propagate and would claim for itself the right chance of being the lawful party in ruling Libya. And that sort of problematic situation could be solved only through democracy, through the peaceful solutions, through the UN intervention. That's why I think Hassan Salama is playing a very good role actually in Libya. But I think before any sort of interference on any sort of individual part, the sort of decision making and decision taking actually should stem out from the Libyan people themselves, of trying to pacify their own disloyalties to each other, disagreements to one another, in much the same way that they would think at the end of the day that the final ultimate solution for saving their own lives, if not saving their own lands as much as their own children and the future of their own generation, I would say, would stem out from reaching to one meeting point and sit to the table, negotiating table outside, and reach to an agreement in favor of saving their own lives as much as their own land as well.
Yes. Well, the final communique out of this latest meeting in Khartoum actually called for the finding a solution through the Libyan people and them determining their own future, which is quite similar to the previous communiques and the previous resolutions of the previous summits and meetings regarding the Libyan file. Then what is really stopping it? Why can't they still just, everybody knows they need to decide their future on their own by themselves. What's stopping them? The division between Khalifa Haftar, the Libyan army, and the government of national accord by Fayez al-Sarraj. And as you've mentioned, there's always also the tribes and these, the third sort of element and factor within this division. How can they find some sort of a compromise or a meeting point for them to take charge of their own future?
The problem stems during the course of 2017, when Colonel Khalifa Qasim Haftar would deny the fact that he is going to be ruled actually by Fayez al-Sarraj, insofar as Fayez al-Sarraj, under the auspices of the Sukhirat Agreement, would play the role of being the Prime Minister, of which the armed forces of Libya, unified armed force of Libya, would seem to be quite under his own supervision. And this is some fact that Colonel Haftar would deny every now and again. And I think that sort of thing was to be postponed. During Palermo, if you may remember, about a month ago, there was some slight disagreement between Haftar and Qasim Sarraj. The fact that Haftar for quite a very short period of time did not approve the process of attending the summit, had it not been for the intervention on the part of the Egyptian diplomacy to convince him at the end of the day that he would have to sit and talk, and even actually to reach to a consensus of opinion. And much the same way that the political authority actually would have its own way with Khalifa Qasim Haftar to convince him even now and again that on no any other account the sort of the political solution could be reached out, had it not been for the fact that you would have to sit and talk with Khalifa Qasim Haftar. That's why our own political authority would reach to a great deal of success during Palermo. But the problematic situation arises actually from the minds of the leaders themselves, from the tribal disputes, from the insistence of now and again on a sort of, sovereignty actually without diplomatic and without democratic solutions. I think that Mr. Sameh Shukri, during his own visit actually to Khartoum, would convince the major parties to sit and talk and to re-elect the sort of the parliament and to reach to a final consensus of opinion by attempting even now and again of reshaping their own map of the road into the inside of their own minds. And here lies the problematic issue. The fact that the Egyptian diplomacy and the political authority would have to have its own way of reconciling, of reshaping and re-editing and re-establishing actually their own disputes in such a way and mixing them in such a way as to reach to a consensus of opinion at the end of the day. So I think that something into the inside of those people would forbid them into, from within, from reaching to a sort of an agreement. And much the same way that the international agenda is always there. I think there is Russia, there is America, there is Italy that would insist every now and again of not leaving the sort of the very much fortunate colonial part that was belonging to the Italian territory to a greater extent for quite a long period of time. That's why we are working on both levels actually, on an international level, by reconciling the attempts of all these international forces of intervening every now and again into their own interests, in much the same way sitting every now and again and talking for quite a long period of time with the two dominant figures and two, eligible supreme leaders, I would say, of almost all the Libyan people, that is Colonel Haftar as much as Faiz Sarraj. Well, I think that Mr. Fattah Sisi is insisting every now and again on the auspices and the intervention on the part of the United Nations, actually. And I think that this Khairat agreement would seem to be quite the final result, insofar as it would solve and would attempt actually to solve the whole issue peacefully in the interests of all concerned, without any sense of individual prejudice or bias towards one-sided attitude, I would say.
Yes.
And I think this is the final solution, and the very democratic one indeed, that would be propagated and very much praised, I think, by the UN.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Egypt has been quite relentless in its efforts to try to find some sort of a reconciliation between the Libyan divisions. Let's check out this report and we'll be right back.
Egypt has sought to be in the Libyan crisis based on its political and security perceptions towards the Libyan crisis, where Libya represents a strategic depth of its national security, as well as the signs of the economic interests and social ties between the two countries. In view of the Libyan political reality after the revolution in 2011, which resulted in political consensus cases, in contrast to spacing cases at the security and social levels. On the political level, Egypt realizes that security and stability of Libya will be achieved through its own people. Therefore, Egypt is seeking to help Libya to get out of the current political impasse, to create a political horizon that brings together the various activated factions and powers in the country. On the security level, Egypt is concerned, as the world shared, about the security deteriorating in Libya. This also shows a new dimension in the Libyan crisis, which there is a possibility of using geopolitical situations in the country to produce militias, political or military organizations. Egypt has two security files. The first is the regional threats that Egypt shares with other neighboring countries in facilitating the entry of drugs or assistance in illegal immigration and trafficking people, whilst the second is securing eastern region in Libya, which has become a security deterioration that is considered a serious threat to Egypt. Through these perceptions, Egypt intends to take a number of important moves, including a dialogue with representatives of the legitimate entities in Libya. Libyan people have become the biggest loser in the ongoing political and military conflicts. On the international level, Egypt has undertaken a series of diplomatic and political efforts to resolve the Libyan crisis, which revives the mechanism of neighboring countries that have given more flexibility to positions of a number of Libyan politicians. From the point of view of the international community, Egypt's role is pivotal and important in the Libyan situation, which was confirmed by the UN Secretary General Envoy to Libya for Egypt's contacts with all Libyan parties.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Abdulhalim, now, we've seen Egypt actually mediating between the Libyan factions quite a while ago, and even having meetings here in Cairo, and then it ends up saying that, okay, the Libyan divisions and the Libyan parties are actually uniting and reconciling, and then time passes by and this no longer exists. So it seems that Egypt is not only trying to mediate between al-Sarraj and Haftar, the government of national accord, and the Libyan army, but also trying to mediate the external forces or the international players that are maybe taking sides between these two factions. Now, how can we actually find some sort of a balance, not just between the two Libyan sides, but also between all these international parties and players who want different sort of interests in the country?
Right. Well, out of the historic ties, as I just said at the very beginning, and the strategic national security interests, actually, for our own concern, it would have to be very much involved, not only in you know, I mean, Palestinian territories, but also into the heart of the strategic safety and security of the Libyan lands. To a greater extent on a regional level, every now and again, as you might have seen, actually, and almost us would witness, actually, we are very much interested of negotiating, of sitting and talking and bringing together, not only, as I've just said, aptly, actually, Khalifa and Sarraj, but also all the factions and opposing tribes and the tribal you know, disputing minds, so to speak, because we've had the same scenario in northern part of Sinai. To a greater extent, the problematic issue would arise not only from the ISIS groups and the interference of all those militants and all those, you know, Daesh groups, I would say, but would come from sometimes the sort of the conspiracies on the part of some minor tribes and tribal figures. The ability, actually, of the political authority of reconciling and bringing all these disputing minds into one main unified interest at the end of the day, which is the national security of Egypt as a land. Also, the same role would be played, particularly when you can really find a great deal of similarity between the northern part of Sinai with its own tribal mind and those tribes, actually, that would exist in certain Tripoli and in Libya in general. The fact that what seems to be quite a bit important is the step that is to be taken and integrated in the part of the political authority towards, you know, I mean, sitting and examining as much as discussing the alternatives and the peaceful solutions, actually, in much the same way that we are very much interested, actually, in the sort of the price that is to be ultimately paid. And we are very much interested of representing that sort of maximal sort of price, actually, that will be paid on the part of the Libyan people. That's why I think Mr. Sameh Shoukry and almost each single individual strategic or high-profile trip to all these countries, he would insist every now and again of representing how peaceful the sort of bringing together all the Libyan people to one meeting ground, actually, not only on a regional level, but actually on an international arena in the meantime. The fact that if it is to be stopped, the sort of the turmoil and the troubles, or the struggles, I would say, I think that a great deal of stability and sovereignty will reveal to a greater extent in the Mediterranean area, not only including the borderline of the Libyan territorial land with other adjacent Arab countries, but almost to Cyprus, to Greece, and to Italy as well. That's why a great deal of effort is being made, and an attempt on the part, actually, of Mr. Sameh Shoukry and his own international visit, actually, would come at the end of the day to one main final solution, which is the final diplomatic, as much as the peaceful solution that should be insisted on and upon. And in the meantime, one of the major issues that had been discussed on an international arena on the part of Mr. Sameh Shoukry is how to arm the Libyan army and the armed forces with sorts of weaponry through the aid of which they can really defend themselves, as much as defend their own individual peaceful citizens against the threats and the attacks of all these militias, particularly the ISIS, that would seem to be quite very much abiding to a greater extent on Libyan territorial part. This is on one level. At another, I think that there is an insistence every now and again on representing the sort of the peaceful solutions through sending envoys to a greater extent to peaceful media. That's why I think that in the interest of all concerned, the sort of the stability and the regional sovereignty of Libya will have its own direct and straightforward influence on the adjacent Mediterranean countries as well, not only the Arab ones, I would say.
Well, there were polls and elections. They were supposed to be held during December of this year. However, they were postponed, and everybody's saying they're slated to be held in the spring of 2019. Now, with the way things are progressing right now, do you think that Libya will actually be able to meet that sort of deadline by spring 2019, or do you think it's going to be delayed again?
I wouldn't say that there is a suitability, actually, in any respect of electing the sort of elections of during the spring, next spring of 2018. And so far as I think the status quo, the whole situation as it stands, it seems to be, it would need and necessitate the fact that a large number of negotiations on both regional and international levels, given the fact that the Palermo, despite the fact that it was one of the minimal summits, it's a mini one indeed, but in the meantime it would include a large number of international countries such as Russia, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Chad, Egypt. And Egypt would seem to be quite representing its own right hand within the previous Palermo summit, actually, through the personal existence of His Own Excellency, Mr. Fattah Sisi, actually in there. And the Tunisians, that's, you know, would seem to be the only two eligible presidents that would attend. And this gives us, you know, a clear-cut portrait of how strategic the intentions of all those two major countries actually within Libya would seem to be. That's why, to a greater extent, given the status quo and the situation as it stands, I think that there will be a sense of prolonging and protracting the sort of the election that was supposed and originally to be held during the next spring, I think.
Yes. Well, hopefully it wouldn't be delayed or prolonged anymore. But talking about the Egyptian foreign diplomacy, now Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry actually traveled today, went to Kuwait, and he's supposed to sign there a lot of agreements and memorandums of understanding. But do you also feel that maybe there is a political aspect to his visit to Kuwait? Now, Kuwait also being a non-permanent member at the UN Security Council now.
Right.
Do you feel that maybe some security issues or political issues would be discussed by Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry in Kuwait as well?
Well, the role that's to be played by the Gulf area in general and Kuwait in particular seems to be a pivotal one indeed to a greater extent. And this is not quite a very short period of time. It's quite a long period of time, I'd say. All of us, as a all of us, we would still remember the sort of the Iraqi attack on the Kuwait, actually, during the late 90s. The only helpful sort of armed forces that would play its own role with a great deal of loyalty and honesty with the Egyptian armed forces, actually. And still, until today, Kuwait would still praise the sort of the strategic and the very much successful role and honest, I would say, role that is to be played by the Egyptian armed forces in liberating the Kuwaiti land. And I think that no matter how you know, hostile, some slight voices actually that would stem out from the Kuwait, you know, I mean, you know, reprimanding and attacking Egypt and the political authority, I think these are very much minimal to a greater extent. And I think also as well the sort of the interest and the sort of the mutual unification on the part of the Kuwaiti people with the Egyptian indigenous citizens and the political authority is very much deeply rooted in the past and to a greater extent very much firmed. Well, Sheikh al-Subah, I think during the late victorious battle of the 6th of October War, 1973, did say one of his own memorable words that, you know, the Arab blood is not as much as to be equal, actually, to the sort of the petrol or the oil. It seems to be a bit expensive and, to a greater extent, a bit dear. And this is one of the memorable facts that is to be repeated every now and again, reminding all those hostile sanctions and groups and factions, I would say, how dear and very much firm the sort of the ties are to be. There had been, still, and would be actually to a greater period of time in future. I think that the sort of the visit, the high-profile visit, actually, on his own, Excellency Mr. Sameh Shukri, would acquire strategic importance so far as you must have said, that being a member of the UN Security Council, in addition to the fact that the sort of the strategic role that Kuwait used to play, actually, in intervening every now and again in the interests of bringing all those, tussling countries together. In much the way providing, from financial point of view, Kuwait is one of the iconic countries, actually, within the Gulf area. And as such, they would interfere every now and again by providing, a sort of shelters and residences, as much as medical treatments for those refugees and those sometimes illegal immigrants, actually, in the interests of safeguarding the borderlines and regaining and stabilizing the sort of the regime in Libya once again.
Yes, definitely. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be following up the latest on the visit of Foreign Minister Sameh Shukri to Kuwait, and hopefully more solutions and diplomacy and smart diplomacy would take place within the Libyan file. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this edition of the Daily Debate. But before we go, I'd like to thank our very distinguished guest, Dr. محمد Abdalhalim, the political analyst. Dr. Abdalhalim, always a pleasure having you with us.
Sir.
Thank you very much, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, please stay tuned for more coming up on Nile International. I'm Henny Saif, and thank you for joining us. And noteworthy, the edX 2018 that started off on the 3rd of this month and will end on the 5th is still going on. Very best wishes.